We've looked at what soft skills are, what benefits they have, how to learn them, but seriously, isn't this whole soft skill business just a scam and a ripoff? We'll find out today. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung, and today we'll find out whether all those soft skill books and training, seminars, public speakers, coachings, and so on, whether they are trustworthy. Well, the answer is yes and no. There is a big market about all things soft skills, and of course there are plenty of black sheep. I don't have exact numbers, but it wouldn't surprise me if the suspicious offerings would make up a bigger part of that market than reputable ones. So how can that be? There are a couple of factors that reinforce and complement each other. First of all, we of course have some people who turn their attention to soft skills. For a reason. There is a variety of possible reasons, and some of those are a bit questionable. First of all, we have people who expect a magic trick, who expect to be successful overnight, to get rich quick and things like that. And yeah, of course, only suspicious, questionable offerings can promise something like that. Then we have people who are driven not by hopes and expectations, but by fear and anxiety. People who say, oh, I need those soft skills to stay on track in my career, to keep up with the competition in the daily struggle in my work life, and if I don't get sufficient soft skills, I will probably be left behind. And again, only questionable offerings will cater to those fears and say, oh yeah, it's a cruel world out there, you better book the expensive seminar to survive in it. And finally, we have people who go into the soft skill topic with outright questionable motives. People who say, I want to learn how to manipulate people, how to get an advantage in negotiations at the expense of the other party, and so on. And again, this is catered to by questionable offerings. So we have a great big market of offerings in regard to soft skills, books, seminars, speakers, coachings, and so on. Accident almost happened. And at one end of this big market, we have the solid foundations of scientific knowledge, solid pillars of evidence-based research. However, it is not uncommon that we are taught scientific facts that are wrong and outdated. One example that is quite popular is the hierarchy of needs or pyramid of needs by Abraham Maslow, that is quite popular, is mentioned quite often. However, it is actually outdated. Nowadays, scientists know that motivation does not work like that. And another example that is very popular in Germany is the idea of certain learning types or learning styles, where the idea is that, for example, some people learn better by having visual things, by looking at things. Other people learn better by hearing things. However, this is actually a neuromyth. In scientific studies, it was never possible to prove the existence of those types or to gain any increased benefit by catering to those types. But nonetheless, they are quite popular, well known, often mentioned, and it is hardly mentioned that they are outdated. At the other end of this huge market, we have a smooth transition to esotericism and mysticism that often mix with soft skills. There are things like astrological coachings, shamanistic coachings, and there are also offerings that have a tendency to esotericism and mysticism, even though it might not be obvious at first glance. For example, the so-called Enneagram personality test has a strong connection to esoteric ideas, even though this is not always obvious, and it is sometimes mentioned in what seems to be a serious and reputable context. Now, if you don't have solid scientific foundations and this whole esoteric and mystic thing isn't for you, you can just make something up. Now, obviously, every method, every technique was created by someone at some point. However, what I'm talking about is that you first create some basic assumptions that are not based upon scientific findings. So you don't use anything that is really proven, that is really known. You just rely, for example, on your experience. You say, oh, well, people work like that because I've met a couple of people and this always applied. So I think this is a general rule. And on this shaky foundation, you then build a technique. You say, oh, well, if people work like that, they can be influenced in a positive way by doing this. And again, you don't waste time with having a scientific study to prove it actually works. You just claim it actually works. And there is a surprisingly big amount of techniques that work this way. All of those, or most of those personality tests and personal typologies like DISC, Insights, MBTI, and so on, they all work like that. And also neuro-linguistic programming, NLP for short, quite popular, quite well known, also belongs in this category. The basic assumptions are not proven, and its effectiveness isn't scientifically proven either. Now, I should point out that it is difficult to draw a clear line here. Even Schulz von Thun's methods and models and theories that I presented in this channel and that I am quite fond of, not all of those are have entirely solid scientific foundations. Not every statement by Schulz von Thun has scientific study to back it up. So there is not such a sharp distinction here as would appear at first glance. Now you might wonder, if certain methods do not work, why don't they fly up? Why don't they fail in the market? I mean, if it doesn't work, people shouldn't be satisfied if they purchase stuff like that, should they? This is not the case, however. A lot of those questionable methods are quite popular, have a great success with the audience. And the reasons for that are quite a complex topic in itself that I can only briefly touch here. Do you like Harry Potter? I like Harry Potter. In the 6th volume of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, there is an interesting story. Harry has acquired a very special magical potion that will grant you good luck for an entire day. Everything you try will be a great success. Everything will work out on that day. Now, Ron the buddy of Harry, he is in a really bad mood at that point. He's had a really bad day. He had some failures he couldn't really get over, and now he is in a very depressed mood. Like, it's all for nothing. It's not worth the try. Everything will fail anyway. So what Harry does is he secretly pours this magic potion into Ron's drink. However, Hermione, the third person in the Potter gang, she notices this and she calls him out. She says, "Harry, how can you do that? Now Ron is going to take part in a sports event and this is basically doping. This is not okay." And Ron, he looks from one to the other and then he quickly gulps down his drink. And he really has great success on that day. He wins at this big sports event, he's everybody's hero, everything turns out great. Then, in the evening, Harry takes out this small flask with a magical potion and he shows to them, and they see that it is still full. He only pretended to pour this potion into Ron's drink. He didn't actually do it because he knew Hermione would call him out, and he wanted Ron to think that he had drunk that potion. And just the idea that he had drunk it gave Ron the strength and the confidence to really achieve success on that day. And even though we obviously don't have this great magical potion, this story isn't entirely unrealistic, because our mindset, our attitude is quite important. If we strongly believe that we are able to succeed, if we have confidence in our own skills and in our own person, then this can really help to actually achieve success. So if someone believes he has gained some magical trick in a questionable training, then this might actually cause a kind of placebo effect that actually helps him be successful. And furthermore, if there is a person who says, "I really want to make a change in my life," who has made a decision, who has a clear intention, and who really takes action, for example, by taking part in a training, even though it may be a questionable training, then this person is quite likely to succeed, because if you've made a strong decision and you take action, then this is the road to actually making progress. And in the end, it's difficult to say if this progress was achieved thanks to or in spite of this questionable training. So it's not always easy to know if this training you took part in, if it was effective in any way. And also our mind, our brain, doesn't like the idea of, "I spent a lot of money, it was all for nothing." This creates a cognitive dissonance. This doesn't really fit together, so we tend to iron out this problem and to say, "Oh well, it wasn't so bad, and the trainer was nice, and maybe it helped a bit." So to sugarcoat it for ourselves, to get rid of this discrepancy. And finally, a thing even questionable offerings usually are able to do is to leave people in a good mood. So after you finish your training, after you finish reading your book or doing your e-learning or whatever, you are in a positive mood, you are motivated, you feel good, you probably had a good time, and we are not likely to sharply distinguish, to say, "Well, I feel motivated now, I had a good time in that training, but I believe it didn't have a lot of practical value." No, we tend to form one big positive package of, "This was nice." And here we also get to organizational and structural deficits, to weaknesses in training and education. Because a lot of trainings, also soft skill trainings, are purchased by companies, and they spend a lot of money on those, so you'd think they'd like to know whether they are effective. And they try to find out. There are different approaches to evaluate trainings. A classical scheme was created by one Mr. Kirkpatrick, and Kirkpatrick distinguished between different levels of evaluation. He said the first level is you just ask the people who just took part in the training, so how did you like it? Was it nice? Was it helpful? And to see whether they give you positive or negative feedback. Second level is you check if a change of behavior actually took place, if they actually learned something. You could do that, for example, by having them write a small test after a while. Third level would be to check if this training had any influence on their day-to-day work. If they have learned, for example, new skills that they can actually use in their daily work. So if it had a positive impact there. And there are further levels, they get more and more abstract. However, the most interesting thing is that after a while, in scientific exploration of the concept, in scientific studies, it turned out that there is very little correlation between those different levels. That means if you ask the people who just finished the training, so how was it? And they say, oh, greatest training ever. It was so awesome. I learned so much. This doesn't automatically mean that they actually learned something or that it had any positive impact on their day-to-day work. If you get good results on level 1, this doesn't mean you will also get good results on level 2 and level 3. However, if any evaluation takes place at all, it usually only is evaluation of the very first level. So you don't get a lot of really useful information, and this might in turn motivate trainers and seminar leaders to say, well, most important thing is people are in a good mood, so they give positive feedback right after, and well, really teaching them important and valuable skills, well, this is a second priority. So this doesn't help either. And of course, on a formal level, the market isn't easy to understand either, because the usual titles such as trainer, consultant, coach are in most countries that I know of not legally protected in any way. Anyone can call himself trainer, anyone can call himself coach, and there are, of course, big important organizations who have training concepts for example, coaches, and who have high standards for their members, and who have strict rules and controls and everything. Well, but of course there are quite a number of such organizations, and some are more strict and more professional than others. So again, it's hard to understand for the layman. If someone calls himself coach, this might mean that he has had very professional training that lasted several months by an organization with very strict rules and strict requirements, and he had to do a really difficult test and everything. Or it could mean he had like a questionable weekend seminar with questionable content. It could even mean he just gave the title to himself. So again, it's difficult to tell apart the reputable offers from the questionable ones. And there is often no clear distinction between questionable and reputable content. So it's not unusual that you have some training, some workshop that is in general on a high level that is professional, that is reputable and everything, but still somewhere in between you suddenly get taught about the hierarchy of needs by Maslow, and the trainer doesn't mention this is outdated knowledge. So somewhere in between you have questionable content, and this is first, this is due to the fact that even trainers and coaches and everybody, people who create seminars and who plan training events, even they cannot always clearly tell apart the questionable methods from the reputable ones. And also we probably again have the issue of questionable motivations. If there are plenty of people who say, I want the quick fix, I want the magic trick, I want manipulation, and I want the method that promises all of this, then of course some training providers are likely to say, oh well, we have to provide that what the audience wishes for, even if we know it's a rather questionable content actually. Now you might wonder, what about the press and what about science? Shouldn't they clearly distinguish between questionable and reputable offerings and tell everybody about it? Well, basically yes, but first the problem is an average journalist doesn't necessarily have the skill and the knowledge either to understand this whole big, complex and hardly transparent market and to really tell apart the questionable and the reputable offerings. So we often end up with articles and reports that mix up questionable and reputable offerings. And for example, critical reports that also hit reputable providers. So this doesn't get any easier there. And of course, we also have reports that are in themselves a bit questionable, that try to be flashy and sensational rather than really providing useful facts. And science, well, first the problem is if there are scientific facts, they might not always be well known. For example, if you earn your money with a questionable method and you know there is a scientific study that proves that your method doesn't have any actual effect, you won't write this on your website in big letters. So who should tell people? And often the question also is who should pay for it. If you earn your money with a method that you know isn't really scientifically sound, you probably wouldn't pay for a scientific study to find out whether it is effective, because you know it would probably the result would probably be something you don't like and that is not useful for you in any way. And who else should pay for this study? Who should pay for a study to find out that something does not work? I mean, even for your competitors, this is probably a bit expensive. So often we don't have a lot of studies. Well, this is the situation to the best of my knowledge and understanding. This is not such a pleasant topic, but of course it belongs to the whole topic of soft skills. So I think it's important to talk about that as well. And of course it is also important to issue a warning. If you actually spend money on anything related to soft skills, on a training, on a book, e-learning, video, whatever, don't just rely on the advertising by the provider himself. Always check out other sources as well, check out other opinions, see if there are critical opinions, and then make an informed buying decision. And even after you bought something, always remain skeptical, remain critical. Always ask yourself if the trainer or the author or whoever makes this statement, how does he know? Where does he get this knowledge from? Ask why, how do you know that? Always remain critical, remain skeptical. I've touched a lot of topics briefly in this video, and we will explore plenty of them in more detail in the future. For example, we will talk about the whole area of where your brain might lead you astray sometimes. We will discuss the biases, the work by Kahneman and Tversky. I will also present some historical outdated theories such as the pyramid of needs or hierarchy of needs I mentioned, and over time we will probably also look at one or the other questionable method. We will also in a future video discuss in more detail what you can do to distinguish between a reputable offering and a questionable one, some pointers of what to look out for, but this would take too much time to include it in this video, so we will do it in a separate video. I think for today this has been quite a lot, so I'll leave it at that for today. Best give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. I heard this will solve all of your problems and you will also get rich. I would be quite happy if you leave me a comment, for example, whether you've had any experiences with questionable offerings in regard to soft skills, or if you can recommend any that are good and reputable. And I would also be happy if you join us again next week in the next video. For today, I take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.